What does it mean to be an American? There are many different ideas out there about that. What is it that is true of everyone? In essence, being an American has to do with being a citizen of the United States of America with all its rights and responsibilities. We have the right to free speech. We have the right to bear arms, to a prompt and fair trial, to vote, to run for elected office, and to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We equally, though, have these responsibilities to support and defend the Constitution, to participate in the democratic process, to pay taxes, to respect and obey federal, state, and local laws, to serve on a jury if called upon, defend the country if needed. At the end of the day, it's our citizenship that defines us as Americans. What does it mean to be a Christian? There are just as many different ideas about that. But we could say that it comes down to being a citizen of heaven. That's what Paul says in Philippians 3:20. He says that our citizenship is in heaven. So we belong to a heavenly government with all its rights and responsibilities. Being a Christian means being a genuine citizen of God's heavenly kingdom. And what are the marks of that citizenship? What is it? What are the defining features that determine what it looks like to be a citizen of heaven, to be a Christian? It's the good news about Jesus that we say we believe. Our citizenship is defined by the gospel. Now, sometimes people say that they believe the gospel, and they mean that they're confident in the benefits of the gospel, the privileges of the gospel. They believe that Jesus has forgiven their sin, that he's reconciled them to God, that they have the Holy Spirit, that they're bound for heaven. But true faith also embraces what the good news means for our lives. Just as you can't claim the rights of American citizenship without its responsibilities, you can't claim the rights of heavenly citizenship without also embracing the responsibilities. If you're a citizen of heaven, if you are a Christian, you need to act like it. How? Well, I can tell you in 4 words. Live worthy of Christ. That's the central message of the book of Philippians. Live worthy of Christ. What I mean by that is to live in a way that fits with what we believe about Christ, this good news that we believe about him. There are many different messages out there that claim to be Christian, but not all of them are Christian. Some of those messages sound good, they sound encouraging, they sound Christian, but they could be dangerous. See, without the call to fit your life with the gospel, then a message about trying to be good is going to promote self-centered righteousness and pride. And without that goal of living worthy of Christ, then a message that focuses on the good that God has for us is going to promote the same pride and self-centeredness. Messages that aren't centered on the gospel are similar to lead acetate that the Romans used to use to sweeten their drinks. See, it worked. It sweetened their drinks. But the thing about lead acetate is, even though it's sweet as it goes down, it's poisonous and lethal over time. And in a similar way, gospel teaching, or teaching without the gospel at the center rather, is teaching that sounds Christian but is just as lethal. Our lives must fit with the good news that we say we believe. And Paul teaches that in Philippians 1:27 to chapter 2 and verse 30. He teaches us to live worthy of Christ. And he begins with the word only, which he's stressing this central teaching in this letter. He's saying, whatever happens, make sure this is true. Make sure to let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. And that word that we translate with the words, let your manner of life be, it's related to the word citizenship in Philippians 3:20. The word there is a noun, but the word here in Philippians 1 is a verb. Now, we don't have a verb form of citizenship. We don't tell people to citizen. So the best equivalent is live. But we should understand that word live, the way that the NLT translates it, you must live as citizens of heaven. See, Philippi was a Roman colony, and they were in present-day Greece. They were far away from Rome. The Philippians were Roman citizens, but despite their Greek surroundings, they lived like they were in Rome, which was over 600 miles away. They dressed and spoke as Romans. They were loyal to Rome. And so Paul drew on their situation to help them understand what it means to be a Christian. We, too, are citizens living far away from our land. We are, as it were, a colony of heaven. And so, just as the Philippians could live like they were in Rome, we're to live like we're in heaven. We're to live with the same values and behavior of heaven. And Paul summarized what that looked like is living in a way that's worthy of or fits with this good news about Jesus. Paul spends the rest of the section explaining that in more detail. And he first explains why that's necessary. Why should we live this life that's worthy of Christ? Why live worthy of Christ? Verse 24 says that one goal is to stand firm. We live worthy of Christ in order to remain firmly committed to our faith, in order to continue in our conviction that Christ is our crucified and risen Lord, and to follow him. Now, there were pressures on the Philippians in their day to conform to the culture of Rome. And we have pressures today in America. We're pressured in America to accept certain lifestyles as normal and valid. We're pressured to agree that there are many ways to God, and that we should not be so focused, so serious about our religion that we would ever question the spiritual state of anyone else. That would be judgmental. We're encouraged by our culture to focus on the pursuit of personal happiness, to do whatever it takes, make whatever sacrifices are necessary, even our own family, in order to achieve our own personal American dream. And we're drawn in that to worship entertainment, trained to prioritize sports and movies and TV and games and other forms of leisure. Current in our culture is not taking us toward Christ. And so we need to focus on living worthy of Christ so that we can stand against that current. If we're going to do that, it's important to understand that Paul isn't just saying to do this in our own strength. We're to stand firm in one spirit. So based on similar things Paul says in Romans and Ephesians, it seems best to view this spirit with a capital S, as in the indwelling Spirit of God. It's only because of the Spirit's presence and power in our lives that we can do this, that we can live worthy of Christ and stand firm. And we do this with others. That's why Paul says that we do this in one spirit. That one spirit is the spirit we all have in common, we all share in. So we don't stand firm alone. We stand firm with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. I'm reading Lord of the Rings right now, and I'm in the second book, The Two Towers. And during the battle at Helm's Deep, defeat looks inevitable. But one of the kings there, Theoden, he's not going down without a fight. And so he's getting ready to make this last-ditch charge into this onslaught of orcs and trolls and evil soldiers. But first he looks over to Aragorn, another key character, and he asks, "Will you ride with me?" He's going into this battle, wants to do it together. There is strength that comes from fighting side by side with others. And standing firm is like fighting a battle. But we're not supposed to do this alone. Paul says that we battle side by side with other believers. Some Christians treat their faith like it has nothing to do with anyone but them. But even if they are strong enough on their own, understand they're abandoning those that would be weaker, their weaker brothers and sisters, to fight alone. That is a self-centered way to follow Jesus. We're not battling for simply our own advantage. Paul says that we're battling side by side for the advancement of the gospel. And yes, that does mean the advancement of the gospel in us, but also the advancement, the impact of the gospel in the lives of others. We stand our ground together, and when we do that, we don't need to panic. And Paul says that when we aren't frightened by those who oppose, It's a sign. When we're not frightened by those that are opposed to Christ and his gospel, it's evidence that they're the ones that should be frightened, because they're the ones that face destruction. And it's evidence that our salvation is certain. We can have this kind of certainty because we know who's in charge of everything. Paul goes on to say that this is all from God. And then in verse 29, he explains how everything that has to do with Christ has been granted to us by God. That doesn't mean he's permitted it or allowed it. God has given us these things. And there are two things that Paul says God gives us. When it comes to the things of Christ, God has given our faith and our persecution. He says more literally that God has given us the believing in him and the suffering on his behalf. Now, that doesn't mean that God believes for us. But it does mean that God opens our heart to pay attention to this good news, just like he did for the Philippian woman named Lydia in Acts 16:14. God does a work in our heart. He creates that good soil so that we'll receive that good word. Now, not only that, but more even to Paul's point, God has given us suffering for Christ. Paul isn't saying that God is actively persecuting us, but he's sovereign over our suffering. It's not just that God has allowed it, it's part of his plan for us. And that's why we can stand fearlessly in the face of opposition, because we trust the loving hand that it came from. Now, we should also recognize that our current circumstances, they're not a reason for us to panic. Especially when it comes to the gospel in our church. We can have confidence that God is still in charge. And we can stand firm together, even in socially distanced ways. The first step, though, is to recognize that we're in this together. We stand firm by living in a way that fits with Christ. That's why we live worthy of Christ, so that we can stand firm together in this faith. But what exactly does it mean to live worthy of Christ? What is living worthy of Christ? In chapter 2, Paul fills in the details of what it means to live your life in a way that fits with the good news about Jesus. It comes down to a mindset. There's a way of thinking that believers need if we're going to fit our lives with Christ. Paul begins with the basis for this mindset. He explains how we're able to think this way. He says that if you're encouraged that you're united with Christ, that you benefit from his life, death, and resurrection, then you can have this mindset. He says if we're comforted by the love that God's shown us, we can have this mindset. If we share in the experience of God's indwelling spirit, then we can think this way. And if we've experienced God's affection and sympathy, or we could say his compassion and mercy in Christ, then we can view things this way. Paul describes this mindset as having the same love. It means having a unified love for Christ and for others. And then he describes it as being in full accord, that it's an inner harmony that A.T. Robertson compared to two clocks striking at the same moment. The shared focus creates unity among believers so that we can be of one mind, striving for the same goal. So what does this unified, loving focus look like? Well, on the one hand, it's not motivated by selfish ambition or conceit. We shouldn't be focused on our own personal benefits, thinking about only what we can get out of it. And we shouldn't think of ourselves as more important than we really are. Now you might say, well, I don't do that all the time. Sure, sometimes I do that, but most of the time I don't. Understand that Paul's saying that we should never do anything from this motivation. He says, do nothing from this motivation. So instead, we should do the opposite. We should be humble. Rather than viewing ourselves as most important, we should view others as more important than ourselves. Rather than thinking about what we can get out of it, we should focus our attention on the interests of others. This is what Leviticus 19:18 is getting at when it says, love your neighbor as yourself. This is a description of love. Paul goes on to give an even more concrete description of living worthy of Christ. In verse 5, he begins to tell us that living worthy of Christ means thinking the way that Christ thought. Now, the gospel is more than just imitating Jesus. Jesus has accomplished something for us that we could never do for ourselves. But now that he has accomplished that through his life, death, and resurrection, then we can follow his example. So what is his example? It starts in verse 6. To be in the form of God there means to possess divine attributes. So Paul's saying that even though Jesus existed as God, he didn't think that hanging on to that status as God was something he needed to do. He gave up the right to be honored as God. That's what he means by that Jesus emptied himself. It's not saying that Jesus gave up any of his divinity. When he became human, he became a nobody. He existed as God with all the honor that is due the Creator, but he emptied himself of that status to become a nobody. And he became a nobody by taking the form of a servant, or we could translate that slave, not the American racist slavery, but the slavery in Paul's day. Jesus became a slave by being born in human likeness. He became a human, and as God, he had the rights due as Creator, but he gave up those rights as a human. He humbly became someone with this lowly status, a created human. And on top of what he's already done to show this amazing humility, it says that he humbled himself even further by becoming obedient to the point of death. So not only did Jesus become human, but he obeyed his Father even to the point of death. And not just any death, it says even death on a cross. Crucifixion was the lowest, most shameful death that anyone knew in their day. So this is a movement from the supremely honored status of divinity to the most utter disgrace. And based on his extreme humility, making himself lower than anyone else could, God the Father exalted him higher than anyone else. Father gave Jesus a name that is to be honored above every name, and the result of that exaltation is that every knee one day is going to bend to honor the name of Jesus. Paul means everyone and everything, every responsible sentient being under heaven or in heaven and on earth and under the earth will acknowledge that Jesus is Lord. And that last part is a quote from Isaiah 45:23, where God promised to do this for himself. So the acknowledgement, the confession that Jesus is Lord is an acknowledgement that he is God. He's worthy of our devotion. So we should follow in his humble and loving footsteps. So what does it mean to live worthy of Christ? It means to live out Christ's same humble love for others. But how do you implement this mindset? How do you actually do this? Go about living this way? How do you live worthy of Christ? Paul explains that starting in verse 12. He talks about obeying and working out your salvation. There's two ways to describe living worthy of Christ. But it's important to notice that he doesn't say work for your salvation. This has nothing to do with saving yourself in any way. What he's describing has to do with putting something to use, using the function of something. If you have a phone, well, you have to use it to experience the benefits of what it was made for. If you have a car, you have to drive it to benefit from it. Your car and your phone, they have an intended use, a function that you're supposed to use. So Paul's saying that we need to work or operate our salvation properly. We need to carry out the function of our salvation. The Bible teaches that through faith in Jesus, we've already been saved from the power and penalty of sin. One day we're going to be completely saved from the presence of sin. But even now, we are being saved from the harmful influence of sin in our lives by being made holy like Christ by the Holy Spirit. So our salvation is a function right now for our lives. purpose of God's present work of salvation is to make us holy like Christ. And we need to operate our salvation according to that function. We need to put our salvation to use. We need to work it out. Paul's saying that we do this continually. So really, verses 12 through 16 are Paul giving us operating instructions for our salvation, for our present salvation. Just like it's important to use operating instructions for some mechanical device before you use it so you know that you're using it properly, we need to understand properly how to work our salvation. First of all, if we're going to operate our salvation properly, we need to understand the power behind it. The power source is God. God is at work in us. That's why Paul says to do this with fear and trembling. At this very hour, we are in the presence of the all-knowing, all-wise, all-powerful, holy Creator. So, fearful respect is the right response to God's presence as we make use of this salvation. Now, it's only on the basis of God's work that we can work out our salvation. God is at work in us to make two things happen, and not just to make them possible. God is at work in us with the result that we will want to work out our salvation, and we will actually do it. In other words, when we have obeyed and lived out this salvation, we can't take credit for it. Because God produced the desire to obey in us. That's what Paul means by to will. And though God doesn't obey for us, he still produced the obedience that we see. That's what Paul means by to work. Now we have to balance this. On the one hand, we can't think that, well, now it's just up to us, but God's done his part, now we have to do our part. But equally, we cannot think, well, if God's in charge of this, if God's going to do this, I don't really need to do anything. I mean, God's going to do it for me. No, we must work out our salvation. We must continue to do that. It's a command. We have to carry it out. I have to work out this life that's lived worthy of Christ, and yet God is at work producing that. Both of those are equally true. But God's work is foundational. It's not that God does his part and I do my part. God's work is the power that produces my desire to work as well as my accomplishing that work. And as difficult as that is to understand, we gotta realize that that's the only way that God could bring about his good pleasure. What he had intended from the beginning. If you're going to operate your salvation properly and live worthy of Christ, you also need to understand the goal of what you're doing. The goal is that we would be blameless in contrast to the people around us. Now, if we're going to be blameless and innocent, as it says there, if we're going to live in such a way that no one could point out blame or impurity, one of the things that needs to be true is that we need to not grumble or argue. Now, the quintessential argumentative complainers in the Bible were the Israelites. So they left Egypt and headed to the Promised Land. And it's clear that Paul has the Israelites in mind when he writes verse 15. See, in Deuteronomy 32:5, it describes Israel as no longer God's children. But the Philippians are children of God. Israel is described as blemished, but the Philippians are to be without blemish. The Philippians are said to be in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, but Israel is a crooked and twisted generation. So Israel's our foil. We're to be the opposite of the grumbling and complaining Israelites. Have you seen grumbling and arguing in the church? Have you seen that in Christian homes? Have you seen that in your home? That is not what God's work is supposed to look like. The goal is to stand out from the people that are like that are arguing and complaining. Paul says that we should shine as lights in the world, just as Daniel 12:3 said about those who will experience the resurrection. See, By our union with Christ, who was risen, we participate in the resurrection now, and we begin to shine already. We shine by living lives that fit with Christ's life, which is a contrast with the people around so that they'll respond by glorifying God. That's what Jesus said in Matthew 5. But how do we operate this saving work? How long do we do that? We do it, Paul says, the duration of this work is until Christ returns. We must hold fast to the word of life, to the word that brings life, to the gospel message that produced life in us. We hold on to that. We continue to meditate on that good news. We keep it in front of us so that we continue to live our lives in a way that fits with that. And we do that to the very end until we stand before Christ in glory. So if I'm going to stand my ground, I need to join with my church and live worthy of Christ, which means to live the same kind of humble and loving life that Christ displayed. And I realize I can't do this apart from God's powerful work in me. And that this is aiming to live as a contrast with the world around me and to do that to the very end. But what does that really look like? Who should I look to as an example of this? Who lives worthy of Christ? That's how Paul ends this section, the end of chapter 2. He gives 3 examples of living worthy of Christ. He describes himself, Timothy, and Epaphroditus in ways that flesh out what this looks like. So Paul says, even if I am poured out as a drink offering, I'm glad and rejoice with you all. He said something similar in 2 Timothy 4:6 in reference to his impending martyrdom. Now, in Philippians, he doesn't think that he's going to die. He's just saying, even if this most extreme thing happened, it would be worth it. I could rejoice still in that. Picturing the lives of the Philippians as a sacrifice to God, his own life would be, in his mind, that Old Testament drink offering, which was a joyful final touch to the sacrifice and to their sacrificial service to God. So Paul could rejoice even when he suffered in prison because he was living for the good of others. And it was his concern for others, for the Philippians, that he sent Epaphroditus and would send Timothy. He was thinking of them. They would have helped him in prison. They would have been a benefit to him, but he was thinking of their good. That's what motivated him, thinking of their interests rather than his own. Then there's Timothy. Paul said he could confidently say that Timothy shared his mindset and that he would be genuinely concerned for their welfare. Timothy was different than the people around Paul. Paul knew of others that seeked their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ, but not Timothy. Like Philippians 2:4, he focused on the interests of others. And then in humble imitation of Christ, he gave up his rights and served alongside Paul as a slave of Christ. And he did that for the sake of the gospel there in Philippi. Now you could think, okay, well, that's Paul and Timothy. I mean, they're a little bit more exceptional. They can't really be our examples. But Epaphroditus was just a regular guy who also lived worthy of Christ. Paul calls this ordinary church member, he calls him his fellow worker and fellow soldier. Might say that this must mean he's a missionary, but he wasn't. See, Epaphroditus simply provided for Paul's needs so that Paul could preach that good news. He was the Philippians' messenger and minister. The Philippian church had commissioned him with this mission, and he faithfully carried it out. And he did that for them because they weren't able to do it. He served God on behalf of the church. He was doing and willing to do what the church as a group, as a whole, was unable to do. Now, he wasn't doing what missionaries focus on, but it was still vital for the sake of the gospel. See, God is at work even in ordinary ways to spread the good news, even in every individual's life in the church. So living worthy of Christ doesn't mean that everybody needs to be a missionary. Epaphroditus wasn't a missionary. I am absolutely certain he shared his faith, but That's not the same as being a missionary. He still lived for the sake of missions, though, even though he wasn't a missionary. He was battling for the gospel alongside Paul, even though he wasn't preaching. And he ended up being a wounded soldier that Paul says we should honor. So what are you doing for the sake of the gospel? Dr. Nick has been using his skills as a doctor in retirement. He's been using those skills to travel around and help the Christian mission all around the world. Now, you may not be able to travel like that. Use what you have for the sake of advancing the gospel. But what can you do? What can you use? What do you have that could be used for the sake of the gospel? We can use whatever Christ gives us for him, for the advancement of his good news, considering others' interests over our own entertainment or leisure, or personal enjoyment. You don't have to be a preacher, a pastor, a missionary in order to do this. Just be willing to do whatever you can do for the sake of others. Right now, that might mean writing cards of encouragement to members of your church family. It might mean making phone calls to check in on them. It might mean rolling a piece of toilet paper onto their porch with a note that says that you miss them and you're encouraged. You just want them to know that you're thinking of them. That's something that I've experienced. You can also do that not just for your church family, but you can reach out to your neighbors that way. It comes down to having this mindset that puts Christ first and others first for the sake of Christ. And the more that we share that mindset together, the more we can stand firm against all the tides and trends and values that are going the other way. Knowing that God is going to empower us to do it. To live like Christ so that we stand out from the people around us. So that we shine against this dark backdrop. So that we stand for Christ all the way until we stand before him in glory. And if we do that, we will live worthy of Christ. Join me in prayer. Father, you are worthy of our adoration. You are worthy of our praise and devotion. And your Son is equally worthy. The Lamb who was slain is worthy of our honor and our devotion. Father, I pray that we would recognize how crucial it is, if we call ourselves Christian, to be like Christ. And to understand that it's not about us working for our salvation. Instead, it's a reflection of your saving work in our lives. And that we would put that to use, knowing that you're the one who's going to make us want to put it to use, and you're the one that's going to actually bring it about. Pray that we would take those steps of faith, knowing that you are at work in our lives. Pray that we would be encouraged to do that, to stand firm together, to realize that we are not alone. Father, even now, it feels like we're alone, but we're not alone. Pray that we would express this truth, that we would live like Christ now in the ways that we can live, that our church family would experience that our neighbors would see it, that we would shine in the midst of the darkness that we see around us. Father, for those that don't know you, Father, if there's one who hears this message and thinks, I don't know, this is not true of my life. I call myself a Christian, but this is not true. I pray that they would recognize what it means to turn away from their sin and to truly trust in what Jesus has accomplished to the point that they want to follow him. They would recognize what true and saving grace looks like. Father, I pray that you would grant us the grace we need to keep going all the way to the end until we stand before Christ. We ask all this through him.